Good morning and good afternoon and good evening. My name is John Herbst and I run the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. We have a wonderful conversation for you today with a distinguished set of panelists. The question is, can President Biden get Mr. Putin out of Ukraine? It's nearly 7 years since Moscow began its aggression in Ukraine, seizing Crimea illegally in February of 2014. Mr. Biden, in his phone call with Mr. Putin earlier this month, said that he is not going to let Russia run roughshod over American interests anymore without serious American pushback. The question is, what does this mean for the war that Moscow's waging in the Ukraine's east, in Donbas? Our panelists today include David Kramer, who's a senior fellow at Florida International University's Václav Havel Center Program for Human Rights and Democracy, Dr. Hannah Shelest, the director of the Security Studies Program of the Foreign Policy Council's Ukrainian PRISM, Ambassador Alexander Vershbow, a distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council's Snowcroft Center, and is former U.S. ambassador to Moscow and former Deputy Secretary General of NATO, and Andriy Zaharanyuk, former Defense Minister of Ukraine. So I'd like to begin the conversation with a question for Andriy. Please, could you describe the military situation in Donbas right now? And what do you think Moscow will do with a tougher U.S. administration in power?
Hello, John. Thank you very much for inviting, and hello, everybody. So, situation is obviously is getting more tense than in the second half of the last year. We already have 4 soldiers were killed from the start of the year, and with direct combat, and there's 2 persons who have died recently on the landmines. And every day we record at least like several of the violations of the Minsk Treaty and informing OSCE. But generally speaking, we clearly see that things are getting more tense. The question is where it gets to. So we obviously can have different scenarios on that. As you know, there's been a huge outrage in Russia regarding the closing of the channels, 3 channels which belong to the opposition bloc members, member of parliament, who also got sanctioned, Mr. Taras Kozak. The thing is that security service been following this case for at least half a year. The fact that he was financing these channels from the so-called LNR and DNR companies registered in those territories. There's a big outrage in Russia. We believe that they would be responding with something. We obviously don't know what they were responding, but if to draw parallels from the previous times, there should be some innovative way of showing that how upset they are about that. So potentially it may be reflected in war in Donbas, but also in a situation and specifically in eastern Ukraine. Potentially it could be something else, but certainly we're expecting that the kind of attention would go up. But generally speaking, the whole situation is being drawn from the status that the Minsk agreement and Minsk process is pretty much stalled, and it's not moving anywhere for some time. And I'm personally in touch with a few members of this contact group, which they clearly saying that Russia is basically doing whatever they can in order to simply sabotage the whole process. And there's not much happening there because generally there is a real lack of intent of actually fixing, or finding the solution. Obviously, they can reach some agreement if this agreement is purely on the Russian terms. But unless that's the case, then I guess the situation got stuck. So Russians know very well that the government of Ukraine is showing the ceasefire as one of its achievements. And indeed, last year in 2020, we had a relatively small number of lost in the battle. We have lost 50 service people. That's obviously way less than in 2019 and so on. So we do have a progress in this. But as we all know, general Russian intent didn't change. So basically, they can obviously change the situation in the east in order to show that, well, if you guys are not like agreeing with what we're suggesting, then you would obviously lose that advantage, and you would be obviously losing more people and so on. So that's quite possible. So generally, very quickly, the situation is tense. We're recording 4 or 5, 10 violations per day of the Minsk agreements, and we have lost already 4 persons in the combat since the beginning of the year. Now the second half of your question is like, well, what Russia is probably going to do with the tougher administration. Well, there are scenarios, obviously, again, but I believe that they would be trying to show that again, the sanctions are not impacting them, that they still can have a sort of continue their policy regardless of the administrations, regardless of the change of policy. And I guess the level of some kind of hostility and aggression will go up in this case, especially in the beginning. But it all depends how steady the U.S. policy and Ukrainian and allies policy towards Russia is developing. So I guess we should build up the policy regardless of that, because basically, as in a typical Russian manner, they would be trying to bully in the beginning. They always been doing this, and they will do this again, and exactly expecting that people will back off, and that's what exactly they shouldn't do. So that's an opinion. Thank you.
Yeah, Hannah, how important? Excuse me. President Zelenskyy and Chief of Staff Yermak have multiple times floated compromise ideas that seem to move at least somewhat in Moscow's direction, but then under criticism pulled back. Some observers claim that Ukrainian public is tired of war and is anxious for peace. Are the Ukrainian people still ready to fight for Donbas and insist on the right of return of Crimea?
Thank you, John, for your question. And I will divide it into 2 parts. First is about probably change of minds that the president of Ukraine is currently demonstrating, because those events that, for example, the banning of the pro-Russian TV channels, about which Andrew just been talking about, and a few other very harsh statements about Minsk process, about what is happening in Donbas, and even more about Crimea and Crimean platform, they are demonstrating that now Zelenskyy is much more matured, probably, and less naive about the Russian Federation and about the intentions of Mr. Putin. The problem is that we still don't know, is it tactical or strategical change of his mind? Does it mean that the time for the big compromises are over, and he is not ready for any compromise, as we've been afraid, let's say in April last year, because many of his statements were very worrying. Nobody could understand where are the red lines that the president and even more representatives of his inner circle can demonstrate. And if you remember, the year ago, there were plenty of scandals like Stop Capitulation movement in Ukraine. There were experts' statements that people were afraid that Zelenskyy can go for compromises with Putin just for the compromises, but maybe even jeopardizing the national interests of Ukraine. However, now we see these new transformation and more tough statements from the president and more coherent statements from his team. What is important, that finally we have at least, let's say, 5 main people who are involved in both Donbas and Crimea tracks, that they're speaking with more or less single voice. The question about population is very interesting. You know, it seems to me that it is very provocative to ask, are you ready to fight or not? There's population should be in the certain conditions to be or not to be ready. Organically, people are not ready to fight. It's not what they would like to do. Definitely, Ukrainians would like to see development, to live just a normal life. And the less fightings are happening, the less people are ready to fight, probably. Another question that Ukrainians, at least when we speak about civil society, are ready to fight at the different fronts. The legal fighting is happening and it is increasing. The expert community is becoming more active. And at the same time, we see the human rights defenders who are activating their work at the different tracks. Members of parliament, their work at the parliamentary assemblies becoming more and more active. And Crimean platform. So it is, let's say, the political track, but that is between the government, parliamentarian, and the expert communities. So, but the question should be: is army is ready to fight? That is probably much more important question as for now, because as we don't have the full-fledged war, we probably don't need the same support as we used to have it in 2014, when all volunteers were just sponsoring armies, supporting in all ways. So now it seems to me that after 7 years, the question already should be asked, like, is diplomats are ready to fight at their track? Is army is ready to fight, and are they prepared really for those challenges that we have? And you understand that it is very easy to demoralize the army. And is parliament ready? And that is probably currently the weakest point of Ukrainian chain of defense, because not only of those pro-Russian political party that is in the parliament and is let's say sometimes are really undermining the efforts happening, but also sometimes the efforts even of the ruling party, because they are very diverse in their opinions about Russia, about ways of doing with Donbas, and on many other issues. So now it seems to me that the next few legislations that are expected to be adopted in the parliament can be that indicator about the readiness of the parliament also to be fully involved in this political fight against the Russian Federation.
Thank you. Sandy, how would you characterize the negotiations over the past 6 years since the first Minsk agreement? And do you expect Kremlin policy to change with the Biden team now in charge?
Thanks, John. I think that to characterize the talks over the last 6-7 years, you have to basically say they've been a total failure. Ukraine and its allies in the Normandy format, with help from the U.S. at different stages, have made multiple attempts to jumpstart the talks and write new roadmaps to implement the Minsk agreements. But Russia has pocketed every concession that's been offered while basically pretending to negotiate. President Zelenskyy thought he could do better. He came into office as the peace candidate. He thought his charm would succeed where Poroshenko had failed. And he got a few minor agreements on confidence-building measures, on ceasefires, prisoner exchanges. But basically, he learned that Putin was not interested in reaching a negotiated settlement, at least not on terms that Ukraine could accept. And I think the problem is that Moscow has continued to insist on interpreting Minsk in a way that would legitimize the puppet regimes in Donetsk and Luhansk and preserve Russian control over the two so-called People's Republics even after Donbas's formal reintegration into Ukraine. And they would do this by insisting that the local elections envisaged by Minsk take place under Russian occupation. So you'd end up with a sham election and integration of kind of Trojan horse Donbas still under Russian control. And unless Ukraine agrees to this, Putin seems ready to prolong the conflict indefinitely. That begs the question, was Moscow ever serious about negotiations? And here I have a slightly more hopeful point to make. I think we saw a window of opportunity perhaps opening up at the end of 2017, early 2018, the beginning of the Trump administration. This was when Putin floated the idea of an international peacekeeping force that could be deployed into the Donbas alongside the OSCE monitors as a mechanism for implementing Minsk. His proposal was too narrowly defined. It was only a potential starting point, but it at least raised some hope that Russia was looking for a way out, and it spawned a whole flurry of think tank reports and track 2 discussions, and even articles in the Russian state newspaper endorsing the idea of a peacekeeping force as a way to end the conflict in Donbas. And so the U.S. tried to explore these ideas in the Kurt Volker Vyacheslav Surkov channel. Again, this was a couple years ago, but there was some hope that ideas were beginning to take shape that could provide a way out. But in the end, Putin and the Russian leadership never followed through. It's hard to know whether Putin was ever serious in the first place. The talks remained deadlocked. Putin and Poroshenko got more and more estranged. Moscow decided to wait to see if a more malleable leader would emerge in the Ukrainian presidential elections. And that's kind of where we are now. Now, will Kremlin policy change under the Biden administration? Your last question. The short answer is maybe. Up until now, the long deadlock in the negotiations hasn't cost Russia very much. But I think Putin has to be taking seriously Biden's warnings that he intends to raise the costs. He's going to mobilize the European allies, the G7 partners, to raise the costs if the deadlock continues. And if Putin sees the threat of even harsher sanctions and greater political pressure, he may, as occurred at the beginning of the Trump administration, be ready to look for a way out. And it's at that point that peacekeeping proposals and other ideas could become relevant again. But I'm not predicting that this is likely in the near term. With Russia increasingly defiant over Navalny and Belarus, as well as Ukraine, this is not the time where Putin will want to show any weakness or flexibility. But if the pressure really is going to mount on him, he may be looking for a way out. And I certainly hope that the Biden administration, working with Europe, working with Ukraine, of course, will put him to the test and see whether we can avoid a protracted stalemate in Donbas.
Yes, Andy, thank you. David, who's going to be in charge of U.S. policy towards Ukraine and the Biden administration? And what do you think the main elements of that policy will be?
John, thanks very much for including me. President Zelenskyy, in his recent interview with Axios, said, "I would like the United States and personally President Biden, who, by the way, is very familiar with the Ukraine, to help us exit this truly tragic situation." And he may be right to some extent. Obviously, President Biden has an enormous amount of challenges on his plate, but he has spoken to President Putin where he raised the issue of Ukraine. Secretary of State Blinken has raised this with Foreign Minister Lavrov and also with his Ukrainian counterpart. And so I expect that there will be more high-level attention, including presidential attention, focused on this situation, in contrast to the previous administration, where there were certainly efforts at lower levels and good efforts, but at the presidential level, it was an unmitigated disaster, where President Trump decided to use Ukraine as a political tool in his efforts to try to deal with his political opponent, Joe Biden. Credit to the Trump administration for providing lethal military assistance to Ukraine, something the Obama administration, President Obama specifically, refused to do. But beyond that, beyond maintaining sanctions largely under congressional pressure, remember the Trump administration tried to lift sanctions a week into office in 2017. I think we'll see tougher sanctions from the Biden administration. I think we'll continue to see the provision of lethal military assistance from the Biden administration. And I think we will see much more personal engagement from the president himself. I think the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, is well positioned to play a serious role on this. I actually don't support appointment of a new special envoy for, certainly not to dealing with Russia more broadly, but even on this particular conflict, in part because negotiating with the Kremlin on this, I find, is rather pointless. They don't acknowledge that they are in Ukraine, that they have invaded the country. And so if you can't even start with the basic facts, I don't quite see what the point of sitting down with them is. So therefore, I would argue that tightening sanctions, ramping them up periodically, even if the European Union won't go along, I hope they will. But foreign policy head Borrell's visit to Moscow does not bode well for a tougher EU policy toward Moscow. And so I think the Assistant Secretary for Europe Eurasia will play a critical role. I think the Deputy Assistant Secretary, the role currently held by George Kent, who I think has done a terrific job, and really salute the work that he has done. Victoria Nuland, assuming she gets confirmed, and she should, as the Undersecretary for Policy, I think will also play a role, having been in the position that Sandy referred to as negotiated with Surkov. But getting an ambassador in Kiev will also be extremely important, since we have not really been without one, despite the heroic efforts of Bill Taylor after Masha Yovanovitch was so unceremoniously removed from that position undeservedly. So I do hope that the administration will take a more active approach at the highest levels.
David, thank you. Andrei, what would you like to see from the United States in the way of military and diplomatic support?
So let me start with military, because this is what I was engaged in for some substantial amount of time, pretty much since 2015, when I was part of this multinational joint commission on U.S. assistance, on actually all allies assistances. The biggest, there are discussions about the increasing of the military assistance with the new administration, and obviously we would support that. It's a matter of discussions and negotiations concerning the what exactly amount it should be, but more importantly is a symbolic meaning that it actually goes up and it actually increases. So that would be a huge signal all around the world, and I guess the importance of that signal cannot be overestimated, really. Secondly, the fact that the weapons should continue supplying exactly for the same reason. They do feel some capabilities which Ukrainian army is missing at the moment, but equally symbolic effect is hugely important in this case, because it shows to everybody, specifically to Russia and Ukrainian defenders, that US is ready to help, and in the case of things go really wrong, I mean, this help can be increased without some additional legal hurdles, because it's already being supplied. Now, regarding the assistance, I would strongly suggest that there is some update of the tactics and update of the policy regarding how this assistance is provided. We have done the analysis on the what went right and what went wrong, and how to increase the efficiency of this cooperation. And the best way is to connect the assistance to the capabilities. Specifically to designing capabilities and building capabilities. That's what US military would like to see. That's what Ukrainian military would like to see. And in the case, if we clearly can trace the assistance and cooperation to the capabilities, to the creating or sustaining or increasing, but specific, not to some part of capability, like for example, weapons or training, but to the complex capability, like with the whole, starting with doctrine and then with the personnel, with the leadership preparation, with the infrastructure, with the weapons. So when it all works together, and then we clearly can say, okay, this is how it used to be. Then after a couple of years of cooperation, military cooperation, that's where we are. So that gives a huge reinforcement to pretty much everybody, starting with politicians, ambassadors, diplomats, military, our military, US military, and all allies, and so on and so on. So I think the best thing we should do is to focus. The typical example, let me give you a practical example, is special operation forces. So they were almost non-existent before. And then with the cooperation with US and with some other allies, we have created that capability. But the cooperation was focused on all components of the capability, not one specific, not some specific one. At the same time, for example, we have seen equipment coming to Ukraine and not being used to the full extent and the full force, and on some other cases. And we clearly can see where the assistance is mostly effective is when it's tied to the overall comprehensive capability approach. So regarding the other one, the diplomatic collaboration and so on, we have some substantial gaps in the defense system, specifically in the maritime domain, for example, that we still consider as the most vulnerable area. And there's been some progress, for example, with Mark 6 boats and some other ones, but we would need to see again Ukraine and its allies, and obviously US first of all, working very close on the on all fronts, including diplomatic ones, including, for example, working with NATO strategy for Black Sea, working with the other countries for the Black Sea, working for creating as much as possible presence of the NATO fleet in the Black Sea, creating some situational center and the situational awareness center in the NATO for the Black Sea, because most of the activities in the Black Sea, for example, they were reactive; they were not proactive. So something happened, and then there were reaction coming, and not immediately, but usually with a lag of like several months and so on. Russians are very innovative in the Black Sea. They are inviting new ways of doing a hybrid war, and we need to be much more proactive. And when I'm saying we, I mean all NATO countries in the Black Sea area, and EOP countries like Ukraine and Georgia. So we need some coherent approach, a new approach for the Black Sea, and I think U.S. Countries as U.S. and U.K. could be leaders in that for sure. So we still are going to NATO. And this would be a loss. There's many things could be done, obviously, in a collaboration between U.S. and Ukraine. But I'd like to highlight just a couple most important ones. As support to NATO and support within further NATO integration for Ukraine, that would be absolutely huge if that can be accelerated with the new administration. We received EOP, Enhanced Opportunity Partner status. It's a quite ambiguous term, and it could be filled with many different instruments depending on how country is active and how many friends it has in NATO, which could give some instruments to these countries. So filling EOP with a true meaning and with a better terms and better ways to integrate further into NATO is something I would have as a clear priority.
Yeah, you can finish up now.
Yes, and then generally the further integration until the membership plan and so on. So that support would be really recommended, and this is huge. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Sandy. Hannah, what is Zelenskyy expecting from Biden and his team, and what is the Ukrainian public expecting?
That is quite an interesting question, because just recently it's been the interview of the president to HBO that president thought as very successful, but Ukrainian public and especially opposition looked at it as quite a fall. The problem was the question of Mr. Zelenskyy to Mr. Biden, why Ukraine is not in NATO. And that's definitely demonstrated quite a low level of understanding, both of what should be done by Ukraine to join NATO, also who disagree with possible Ukrainian membership, and what the United States can do for Ukraine. But that's definitely, let's hope that it was just not very correct sentence on behalf of the president. But in general, it seems like the president is going with the classical set of issues. First is the military support, and many of those issues that Andrew just named. Definitely Zelenskyy is expecting more of the military technical support. It can be more boats or more javelins or other type of weapons, but something feasible and material. The second, it is the great assistance within NATO, and it is not only enhanced opportunity partnership, but it is the full support inside of NATO. And probably one of the expectations is to help with Hungary, which is blocking the Ukraine NATO Commission. But also that is the support against the Russian Federation at the diplomatic scene, and here sanctions are going as the first and foremost. And what is interesting that in the same basket with sanctions, Zelenskyy is putting Nord Stream and assistance with blocking, or better to say, the continuing the policy of the previous administration about sanctions against the Nord Stream. The issue is that the third probably topic, it is financial support. or better to say, it is support in negotiations with financial institutions like World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and others for Ukraine to receive additional funding. And one of the signals that confirm this idea is the appointment of the new ambassador of Ukraine to the United States. So we are waiting now, just probably in a few days, maximum weeks, that it will be officially announced, but it is already confirmed. The former Minister of Finance will be the new ambassador. So the idea is definitely that the main task she's given by the president, it is to get as much as possible of the financial support. The issue is that we don't see the coherent vision of the current administration in Ukraine about the relations with the United States. So we see the patchy picture of some standard ideas of what for the 7 years we are repeating. The new idea is joining Crimean platform, the new initiative that we are having, but still it is very vague. So here still Zelenskyy cannot formulate what exactly he is expecting from the United States within the Crimean platform. And then we see that most of these issues, they are for defense. Doesn't matter in military, political, diplomatic way, but we don't see that much propositions about the development, about sustainability, about going further with that support that the United States can provide for Ukraine. And here it seems like it is still probably time for some negotiations and understanding within the Ukrainian presidential administration. Because definitely when you speak, you said what is expert community is expecting, the expectations are much wider. When you speak with the energy experts, they are speaking a lot about the necessity of the energy diversification and energy security. When you speak with the security experts, except of the military support that Andrew named, they are speaking also about such issues as lessons learned component of creating of the lessons learned system for Ukrainian military, or about the sustainability of that support for Navy that we have now, because you can have a board, but it is the question, will in 2 years it be the same sustainable? Will Ukraine be able to maintain or to do all other necessary stuff about these new boards? But also experts are speaking about the investments, about the joint ventures, and we have some examples, and that is something we would like to see more in this sphere, and probably assistance with more representation of Ukraine in public life of the United States, meaning that now Ukrainian picture in the US is predominantly war or something through the prism of Russia. And now it's time also to demonstrate other parts of Ukraine, something not to see just as a threat, as a danger, as a problem for the United States policy, but also as the possibilities for joint projects and for the joint probably enterprises in the future.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Sandy, what do you think the Biden administration is going to do regarding the Minsk process, regarding negotiations in general?
Well, first of all, I agree with what David Kramer said earlier, that it's going to be a very high priority for the administration. I mean, the president is a true believer in defending the sovereignty of countries like Ukraine. And he also knows that the stakes go well beyond Ukraine in terms of defending the international rules-based order and bringing back Russia into compliance with international law. So I think he's going to assign this issue to one of his, either to Secretary Blinken himself or to one of Blinken's top deputies, and definitely seek to play a very active role, leadership role for the United States in diplomatic efforts. The Ukrainians have suggested that the U.S. should join the Normandy format. The administration may be prepared to do that, although the Russians have used that more as a way of playing the parties off against each other than seriously negotiating. But the Russians would have to agree, and it may be sufficient just for the U.S. to play an active role using its bilateral connections rather than getting into the group activity with the Normandy format. I think the big challenge for the administration is to come up with the leverage that's going to be needed to get the Russians to stop just marking time in these talks and actually seeking a deal. That starts, of course, with working with the Europeans on a strategic approach to sanctions. It also includes working with the Congress, getting some kind of understanding about their readiness to support the lifting of the sanctions if Russia actually negotiates. Because I think right now the Russians think that sanctions are going to be there forever, no matter what they do. But I also think that the administration will definitely look for ways both to support Ukraine in the defense field in terms of its NATO integration, but also to use this kind of support as another way of putting pressure on Moscow. And indeed, NATO does need to flesh out what it is going to provide Ukraine under this enhanced opportunity status. The administration may want to consider major non-NATO ally status for Ukraine as another way of showing the Russians that we're not going to abandon Ukraine. We're going to boost their relationship with NATO. And I think the time may come even for a membership action plan. I think the administration, if it plays a leading role within NATO, can get NATO to take that important step, which has now been promised for over a decade. So building leverage is just as important as playing an active part in the negotiations. But I think that given the commitment of some of the individuals in the Biden administration, including the president himself, including Toria Nuland, I think you'll see a very proactive U.S. approach to the diplomacy.
Benny, thank you. David, bipartisan support for Ukraine has been a feature of U.S. politics for 30 years. Will this continue under Biden? And what do you think the U.S. should do in supporting Ukraine in the war and the talks?
I do think it will continue, John, and actually I think it is likely to be stronger. I don't think we will see some of the exceptions to that as we did in the past 4 years, where some members, particularly in the Senate, were either witting or unwitting agents of Russian disinformation and bad-mouthing Ukraine and dragging Ukraine through the mud. And I think that was incredibly unfortunate. So I hope under the change in control in the Senate that we will not see such episodes repeated under new chairmanships. I also think that the Congress will continue to push for more sanctions on Putin and his circle. I think they will push for continued U.S. military support for Ukraine. And I think they'll also call for more of a Black Sea strategy writ large rather than just Ukraine, because there are other countries in the Black Sea that are threatened by Putin's military adventurism. I also think that the administration will win support in Congress for what looks like is going to shape up to be a tougher line toward Moscow. I think it's good that President Biden renewed the New START treaty right off the bat. That issue is now off the table. We don't have to be dragged through prolonged negotiations about extending New START. With that done, I think President Biden and his team can focus on making life more difficult for Mr. Putin so that he feels pain across the board. And that would, if you look at what he's requested of his intelligence community, more information about Russian election interference, the hacking that took place last year, the poisoning of Navalny, reports of Russian bounties on US forces in Afghanistan. I think that bodes well for those of us who have argued for a tougher line toward Mr. Putin, because I think that's the only way of trying to get Putin to understand that the cost for continuing his aggression, his violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity will incur serious costs.
Okay, David, thank you. We're now going to turn to audience questions. We've got a bunch already. David, I'm going to give you the first one because what you just said relates to the very first question on our board from Mike Blazensky. President Biden gave in to Putin on the START treaty. Why will Biden be able to get Putin out of Ukraine? Now, you are known as a strong advocate of pushing back against Moscow. You just endorsed what Biden did on START. So if you could take this question.
I think renewing New START is in both countries' interests. And so I commend President Biden for getting this done. President Trump tried, but in trying to work China into the equation, I think he gummed up the process. But I also commend President Biden for getting it done so quickly within the deadline of February 5th when the treaty would have expired. That means that we don't have to focus on New START for a while. I'm not saying there should be no more arms control efforts with Moscow, but having gotten New START done and out of the way the administration can focus on these other areas of egregious Putin behavior and focus on pushing back on this behavior, whether it's this abysmal crackdown on human rights in Russia over the protests, the poisoning and arrest of Navalny, and continued war and aggression against Ukraine, continued occupation in Georgia, human rights violations in Syria, you name it. There are many problems that we have with Mr. Putin, and I think getting New START done and renewed is a way for us to focus on these other areas.
Thank you. Again, so for our panelists, please keep these answers to under 2 minutes so we get to as many questions as possible. We have a question from Ambassador Robert Brinkley. In Crimea, water shortages are only getting worse. How does the panel assess the risk of Russian military action aimed at reopening the canal to Crimea? And so, Andrei, if you could take that, but please, 2 minutes.
As always, with wargaming and building scenarios, there is no single answer. And we're studying this because indeed, last year specifically, there's been a significant attention to this matter because of some press materials of some analysts, which we all know, and which raised like a huge interest to this subject and a lot of discussions. Honestly speaking, with what we see so far, they will not be able to make a very quick jump to the channel because the channel starts. The Crimean channel starts with the Dnieper River in the area of Kherson, and basically it's about 70 to 100 kilometer triangle from the Crimea, from the Crimean line of basically a line of separation. I cannot call it a border, but basically, so this is a line of, and there's 100 kilometers and 70 kilometers from the other distance. So technically, it might be possible for the a quick operation, but in reality, when we analyzed it, it would involve much bigger forces and it would involve much more serious operation, and we don't see this. They've been capable of creating such a plan and implementing such a plan without a substantial losses, without basically starting in a fully fledged war. So answer to this question gets to the answer, is Russia ready to the fully fledged war? Because they cannot reach that goal without it. And so far, we don't see this as a really high chances, but nevertheless, we obviously should look at this area as a risky one. Thank you.
That's a smart way to look at it. Thank you. Okay, our next question, and forgive me if I mispronounce your name, is from Sigbrin de Jong. What is your view on the recent organizing of the Russian Donbas Forum and the presentation of the so-called Donbas Doctrine? For those in the audience who are not familiar with this, this is a proclamation by people in the occupied territories or the leadership, so-called leadership there, that this is historically part of Russia and forever part of Russia. Hanna, if I could ask you to address that, but also I appreciate your sense of the significance in terms of the war against Russian aggression of the closing of the 3 television stations.
Thank you for the question. First, very briefly about the Russian forum. It looks like it was more for the domestic audience, for the Russian audience, because even Ukrainian media covered it very briefly. A few very scandalous statements, but nothing that really surprised. The doctrine as well, it rose mostly laugh rather than a serious approach, because any historian or linguist or anybody will explain you exactly when and where these territories were part of Ukraine, Russian Federation, Russian Empire, or any other legal constituency. So that is more of the local manipulation, that to create certain images to support the interest within the Russian society. And we should not forget about this, that for Putin, it's also very important to continue support inside of the Russian Federation. So to hit these support inside of the country, both to explain why he's in Donbas, why this support is needed, but also to distract attention from other problems. So not only Navalny, but all other scandals happening happening around the Russian Federation. So that's why we didn't care about this forum in no way other than propaganda event for domestic audience, not even for the foreign audience. Considering closing of the 3 TV channels, difficult question. Let's say that legally it is a little bit dubious because the legislation on sanctions for Ukrainian legal entities is not so clear written as for the foreigners. So the National Security Council, who proposed these sanctions, they definitely can expect certain legal cases against them. But politically, it was definitely overweighted decision. Because what had been happening at these TV channels for the last few years, it had nothing with media. And it is nothing about opposition or not opposition. We still have other TV channels that are opposing the presidential policy or even opposing the national security issues. But these channels, it was mostly about propaganda. There were a lot of retranslating of the Russian messages, Russian videos, plenty of guests connected with Russia. It was exact propaganda of the few politicians. One of them is a personal friend of Mr. Putin. So you can imagine the whole set of messages and narratives that he's been trying to promote. So here, to be short for your question, politically, it is a timely decision, even a little bit late, but legally, we still can expect certain problems with this decision.
Thank you. We have a question from Dmitry Oshurko of the National News Agency of Ukraine. It is, after the humiliating and controversial visit last week by Mr. Borrell to Moscow, is it not, you think that the Russian regime there has finally crossed the red line and turned Russia into an open dictatorship? And in that regard, is it possible that there's really no hope for any constructive cooperation with Russia? Sandy.
Well, the visit by Mr. Borrell was clearly an embarrassment, I think, for Europeans, and that's what I'm seeing in the European commentaries on this. The fact that they expelled European diplomats right in the middle of his meeting with Foreign Minister Lavrov was a real provocation. And I don't think Borrell reacted forcefully enough at the time. But I think it does suggest that Russia does kind of feel besieged by the West. And of course, it only has itself to blame in terms of its aggressive behavior, whether it's Ukraine, threats against Belarus, or of course, sending Mr. Navalny back to jail after failing to assassinate him. So it does suggest that the prospects for improving relations with Moscow are pretty bleak, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't challenge the Russians diplomatically, and I think that applies to the relationship writ large, but also to the Donbas issue. Make clear that the price of prolonging the status quo is going to continue to rise for Russia. The costs of occupying Donbas may not be all that much for the Russian state budget, but I think if the Russian taxpayers heard a little bit more about it from the Voice of America and other information sources, they might begin to wonder whether this kind of adventurism is in their long-term interests. But I think the key is show that sanctions are not just going to stay in effect, but they're going to get more stringent if Russia continues to dig in, that the Ukrainian relationship with NATO is going to get closer, and that occupying territory doesn't equal a veto over Ukraine's Atlantic aspirations, doing other things to make clear to the Russian people that Putin is leading them down the wrong path. I think that could, maybe not immediately, but in time, convince Putin to cut his losses and end the war in Donbas. That still leaves Crimea. I think the Biden administration is going to make very clear that we're not going to forget about Crimea, but Donbas is where the rebuilding of the relationship can begin. But it takes Russia to change course, and I think we're better placed to convince them to do that than we were when we had the incoherent policies of the Trump administration.
Sandy, thank you. We have a question from Oksana Bashuk, which kind of follows up on the same subject. I'll pose it to David. She says, incremental punishment on Russia has not worked. Putin moved ahead with his no military expansion into elections meddling, masterminding propaganda, and so on. Here we're hearing more about incrementalism. What would be a more forceful response to Putin, and why are the US and NATO at all afraid to do it? David.
Well, I think that sanctions have not really been ramped up in a serious way. I think we need to test that theory much more seriously. And by major sanctions against Russian enterprises, against Russian individuals. And look, I think it's going to reach a point at some point this year, including with the Duma elections, which I assume will be pretty ugly in Russia, where we have to start talking about sanctioning Mr. Putin himself. That might get his attention. Sanctioning people around him apparently has not been enough, but I think if we started discussions and conversations about sanctioning Mr. Putin, that might be a US only kind of sanction. It's hard for me, particularly after the Borrell visit, to envision all the EU member states supporting such a sanction. But I think we have to keep ramping up the pressure because negotiations in the past have not worked. Visits to Moscow don't work. And I think it also has to be part of a larger strategy where we push back against cyber attacks and hacking by the Russians. We show them what we are capable of doing. Nobody wants a confrontation with Moscow, but Mr. Putin is showing that he is not backing down. He's firing some arrows over the bow right now toward us as the new administration gets settled in. And he's also testing the Europeans and I think tightening the pressure on cancellation of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline would also be an effective means. That would be, I think, a serious blow, and it also would help Ukraine, which otherwise would be deprived of some $2.5 to $3 billion in transit fees a year.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Ekaterina Magaladze of VOA Georgian Service. Dave, I think I'll give this to you. She says 2021 also marks the 13th anniversary of the August War in Georgia and the further seizure of Georgia's territories with ongoing creeping occupation. Last week, Zaza Gahaladze, one more Georgian citizen, was illegally detained by Kremlin-backed Chinvali authorities and was sentenced to 12.5 years. How can Georgia, its partners, and the new administration of the U.S. address ongoing Russian occupation of Georgia, as well as the particular provocative actions by the occupation regime like these detentions, and again, the creeping internal border?
It's an important question because what happened in 2008, I think, was a precursor of what we saw in Ukraine in 2014. And remember that the West didn't impose any sanctions on the Putin regime for its invasion of Georgia in 2008. And there were no sanctions today because of Russia's continuing occupation of 20% of Georgian territory, the creeping annexation that we see of the demarcation line. So I think that there needs to be more pressure on the Kremlin over its activities in the entire neighborhood. And we need to lay down a line about Belarus as well. So far, Russian forces have not invaded in a serious way. We've seen Russian security forces go in. We've seen Russian TV presenters go in. But Mr. Putin is also doing a pretty good job of turning all of his neighbors against him. One way not to win friends over is to invade them. And so we have to make it clear that if he wants to serve his own interests, invading, continuing occupation of other countries is not the way to do it.
Okay, thank you. We have an anonymous question for Andrei. Let's see, where is it? Well, what if, I guess, the NATO integration is the golden egg of Ukraine's leadership? What if Europe and the United States does not want that? What if they do not want to extend the collective defense umbrella to Ukraine?
Do I understand correctly that the question was, what if Europe doesn't want that? Is that right?
Europe and the United States, meaning the NATO countries.
Okay, so on United States, first, I have spoken to a whole number of different politicians and military personnel and diplomats and so on. So I see that the majority of the US establishment basically supports the Euro integration goals of Ukraine. So I haven't seen a critical mass that, somebody would be really against that. And obviously there are probably such people, but a clear majority is supporting this. Regarding Europe, Europe is not a country which is member of NATO. There's no such thing. We have obviously European Defense Agency, but he's asking about NATO. We have separate countries, and each of them has equal voice because they need to have a unanimous approval, such as we received during the obtaining EOP, Enhanced Opportunity Partners. So the situation is that we cannot say again there is a very coherent approach. Some countries are against that, some against Ukrainian NATO membership. Some countries are clearly supporting that, and I'm sure that it's widely known which are which. Our job is to work together with the countries which are still hesitating, or countries which have some opinions, and maybe because very often explaining and diplomacy and talking to them and showing the basically the options and scenarios can actually form their politicians' opinion towards the support. We're explaining that actually Ukraine is defending not just itself. Ukraine defends the whole Western world. Ukraine defends the democratic world, including Europe, against Russia threats. And if Ukraine, for example, in a hypothetical scenario, would not exist or would surrender to Russia, they would move on. They would move on to Baltic states. They would move on to Eastern Europe. Because the Russian strategy is basically to oppose to the West, not as a whole, as a concept, to the basically democratic world, and which because they look at Europe as a like two hockey teams, a Western team and Russian world team, and that's how they see the game. It's not just about the Ukraine. So we need to. That needs some explaining. That needs understanding of the politicians. They may have many other things to worry about, but we need to like them to look strategically at the things and think not just like a one step ahead, but several steps ahead. And when that works, we have seen people's opinion changed quite significantly. And there's many European countries which are clearly supporting Ukraine towards NATO membership. Spoken to many ministers of defense before from different countries. It's absolutely clear. So I wouldn't say situation is that bad as it may sound from the question. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we have a question from Christoph Watts. Hans, for you. Can more be done to help the people of the DNR and the LNR in terms of reducing poverty and providing pensions and such?
That is a question who is responsible. Here definitely it's always can be done more, but at the same time, that is the question of the legal issues as well. And it is the obligation of the occupied power, or at least if we go with the legal terms of the state who is executing the effective control of the territory to fulfill obligations about the human rights, about social protection of people, and all others. And here we already have quite a number of the legal decisions by the international bodies that confirm that Russia has the effective control over those territories. So if we speak about Donbas, so those people who are with the Ukrainian citizenship, they have a right for pensions and for other stuff. The question is that they can receive them only at the territory of Ukraine, and but of the governmentally controlled territories. The question is just of the pure security, because in the very beginning, when there were attempts to deliver some of the money, for example, for pensions or for other subsidies to should deliver something to the occupied territories when they can't guarantee the physical security and safety of this delivery. And definitely nobody now can guarantee any kind of such security, because even the OSCE special monitors do not have the full access to the uncontrolled territories. So that is like a snowball. One is coming after another, that if we can't organize the safety, if we can't organize the monitor, the question is how we can do it. So we can have the best will, but these questions should be asked, the very practical questions should be asked. So definitely the only thing that Ukrainian government can do it is to be sure that the contact points on the between controlled and uncontrolled territories, they have the proper infrastructure for people not to go very far, for example, but to have a possibility to have the legal services from the state, to receive maybe their money from ATM or from the bank, very close to the contact line between controlled and uncontrolled territories. But here as well, we have the issue that very often these contact points are open from Ukrainian sides, but Russian-controlled separatists are not opening them from their side, especially during 2020 with the pandemic excuse. We heard about more and more cases of not allowing people to cross the line, or even the awful cases when people were left in the gray zone in between. So they left Ukraine, uncontrolled territory, and they were not allowed to enter uncontrolled territory. So before asking what Ukrainian government can do more, these technical questions should also be asked.
Anna, thank you very much. We're over time, but I'm going to give Sandy the last word. Sandy, if you can just in 1 minute answer this question from Paul Carter. In addition to the stick of sanctions, are there any carrots that we'd be willing to offer Putin to get him out of Donbas?
That's a tough question. And it gets into this issue of Ukraine's future role in the Euro-Atlantic community. I think we can expect that if Russia ever gets serious, it's not only going to be looking for sanctions relief, but it will be looking for some assurances regarding Ukraine's future relationship with the European Union and NATO. And I think that's going to be the toughest thing for the West to handle. I think we need to remain true to our commitments that every nation has the right to choose its own future and choose its security arrangements, including alliances. And we should not foreclose Ukraine's options in the negotiations. But there may be broader initiatives that can be taken to strengthen European security, to give Russia more sense of involvement in decision making, whether it's an increased role for the OSCE or giving more substance to the NATO-Russia Council so that the Russians feel that they're getting something out of it. That's, I think, something we need to start thinking about in case diplomacy succeeds and Russia starts putting those kinds of issues on the table. Maybe we could negotiate a new code of conduct, which would be a way of getting the Russians to recommit to the principles of the Helsinki Final Act, which they've trampled upon in their invasion of Crimea and Donbas, and earlier of Georgia. So we should never say never to Ukraine's aspirations to join NATO and the EU, but we should think about European security architecture as a way to kind of bring the Russians out of their defiant posture and back into the mainstream.
Danny, thank you very much. And thank you for all of our panelists for joining us today. And thank you for everyone who's tuned in. We'll be doing a lot more on the subject in the year ahead.
Thanks.
Thank you.